Now that I've had ample time to test out this deck, I think it's time I do a proper deck profile for my what I formerly called Water, Earth, Wind Control Beatdown deck, and now I've just given it a more fun name as I call it my Foamee Armada deck. So I've been keeping up my deck previews. This deck still does a lot of the same things I wanted it to previously, but I've definitely refined it to make it better for what people are actually playing and kind of refocused my use cases on some of these cards. So let me just get right into it. Of course, the focus of my deck has always been Capricorn and Globby being two fantastic Ascension Elestrals, or two-spirit Elestrals that you can ascend into, where Capricorn I think is the better of the two. At 8 attack and 5 defense, that's a great stat line. It also, whenever it destroys an opponent's Celestial in battle, being able to special chant a Foamee from the Underworld just means that you're able to go wider on board, and the Foamee can actually attack right away. So I really like this card for its impact on the board, but that being said, though, it is reliant on having a Foamee in the Underworld, so it isn't always good. Hence why I like the 2 Globby, as the 5 attack's still phenomenal. 8 defense doesn't really come up too much. I mean, it can, but with how much destruction is currently being run in most decks, it really doesn't matter if it's in defense. Most of the time, your opponent's just destroying with an effect anyway. But I do like its beatdown potential, being to enchant an extra Water Spirit to draw 1, means you're seeing more cards from your deck, meaning you're more likely seeing answers to what your opponent tries to do, and just being able to get that extra spirit on board to force your opponent to expend 1 extra spirit is also really nice. So Globby only at 2 copies because it's definitely a more risky card as it puts more spirits on the board for your opponent to try to get rid of. But if you time it just right with what your opponent has out, it can be devastating. So hence why I still like it at 2. I can't call my deck the Foamee Armada without including 3 copies of Foamee. While not the most amazing stat line, I really like its ability to float into another 1 Spirit Water Celestial from deck whenever it's destroyed in battle. It just means that sometimes your opponent's going to want to try to answer it with card effects, and especially if you have, say, like you called it off of a Capricorn from the Underworld, it's really hard for your opponent to decide because Capricorn is the bigger threat, but also Foamee can still float into stuff and be super obnoxious. So while it definitely costs you 1 Water Spirit every single time, just being able to keep a presence on the board to be able to go into stuff like Capricorn and Globby is phenomenal. On top of just being able to ascend Foamee into Capricorn from hand and attack over something Capricorn, immediately get back the Foamee, it just synergizes really well with what I want this deck to do, and also really was. Well, I say Capricorn and Globby were the focuses of the deck. Globby certainly was. Foamee was kind of like that third piece in there because I saw the potential in this card to help me ascend it more easily. Also run 3 Mustachian, as this is a phenomenal way to answer board, as that 6 defense is really high. So being able to call it off of a Foamee can shut down your opponent's attacks more often than not, as they're really, unless they have like a Veritako, they got no destruction effects, or something that can attack over 6 defense. But they don't really get the chance to activate their Invoke runes anymore in the battle phase. But also the ability just to expend 1 water to swap its attack and defense is really useful, as being able to set it to 6 attack means it's hitting an even better magic number than all other Elestral, 1 Spirit Elestrals in the game currently. It does cost you a Water Spirit, but it's still nice. And then on your opponent's turn, you can actually expend a Water Spirit to flip its attack and defense as well, meaning it's especially hard for your opponent to deal with it if it's an attack during their turn, and can make them think twice. You have to be really careful with that effect though when you use it, as you need to make sure that you know what value you're getting out of it when you use it on your opponent's turn. Because I've certainly had plenty of times where my opponent will enchant an Elestral and be like, okay, are you going to use Mustachian's effect? And I have to kind of decide, like, do I want to use a spirit on this one because sometimes it's the case of it's a spirit to protect Mustachian, as your opponent will either not attack or attack something else, or they might still have a response to it. So you do have to be careful when you use its effect defensively, but if you can master using it or make some good reads, this card definitely can return a lot of value for you, mainly in the part of this deck of wanting to keep up on the board and really just take out your opponent's Elestrals on their board so you have more Elestrals on board, that is. Rounding out the Water Elestrals, I run 2 Tadpuff and 2 Afros. The Tadpuff are here because this plus a Capricorn and Globby in hand means you can immediately get out these Capricorn and Globbies, which is really nice, especially if Capricorn might be your only way to attack over something. I only run it at 2 because I found that I really wasn't using this combo as much as I thought I was. It's high risk, high reward, first of all, but also sometimes if I'm just ahead on board enough, I can just normal set a Capricorn on top of a Foamee and call back the Foamee anyway, and that play cost me 1 less spirit. And especially when the board starts getting full, sometimes that's the best way to do it, as if I were to use Tad Puff into Capricorn, my board would be full and I wouldn't be able to call it a Foamee anyway. So that's why I think Tad Puff's still good, but I don't think it's as great because it's also a huge punch for your opponent's counter runes up on board. So it's not always going to be a great play, but it's a nice play to have access to, especially in the late game when you and your opponent are on fumes. Just be able to get up a big body on board with a 2-card combo definitely feels really great. Alphros is here for 2, a new inclusion in the deck, because the 4 defense is fine. It isn't amazing in this specific deck in particular. It's pretty easy for the opponent to deal with, but I like its Nexus ability to draw 2, as it's a good neutral play to have, as a lot of these cards are more styled behind reacting to what your opponent has. And just having 2 extra cards on top of, like, Foamee is a more neutral play, but having 2 extra cards that also nets you like immediate value is phenomenal. This also has further synergy in the late game, especially if you have like a Globby out or some other cards I'll get to. Just being able to move spirits around to more evenly distribute them and then also draw more cards off of it is great, as it will mean that you get, if as your opponent tries to answer your board, you might have more answers to respond to that and stop them. So I really like that fact, as it kind of helps secure the victory once ahead on board as well. So I'll once I get to some more of my cards, I'll explain more use cases for this card. It's definitely more of a situational card, but I mean, this entire deck's more respond to your opponent, so it makes sense I will have a ton of situational cards, and this just is a different angle to those situations. I still have my strong Wind Celestial package, being 3 Paycust, 3 Sorlet, and 2 Peliquarius. Nothing more to be said from my deck previews, as Sorlet's just phenomenal for answering the board, being able to switch things between attack and defense, and with that 5 attack, can easily just be a 1-card answer to whatever Celestial my opponent has on board. P-Gust, again, is great for those runes, as the counter runes are probably the scariest thing for this deck, and just having access to P-Gust to try to disrupt them is phenomenal, especially if my opponent feels like they have to use another counter rune on P-Gust. I can get rid of 2 runes for this 1 card, which is phenomenal. And it's also nice if my opponent's running more of like a lot of runes to buff the board, as shown in some of the gameplay that I have. I had that gameplay yesterday. I don't know when it'll be up in relation to this though. But just having P-Gust also to kind of answer those is just phenomenal. I would say it is one of the best, if not the best, Celestial in the game right now, as it has such a simple yet powerful effect. Peliquarius here, again, just a good neutral play on board. Doesn't have amazing stat lines, but if I don't need to respond to something, just being able to throw out a Peliquarius and grab a Water Spirit is phenomenal. Can search out my Foamies if I need it, search out Mustachian if I need something to respond next turn, Aphros if I want to draw more cards next turn, Tadpuff if I need access to an easy ascension. Just really can find all those pieces, especially when I don't necessarily need to respond to my board right away, or my opponent's board right away, or with another card combo, Peliquarius can take care of it itself. Moving away from my Elestrals, my green package has changed ever so slightly. I only run 3 Demeter and 2 Earthquake now. I completely cut the Scythe. I really wasn't using it. I have so many ways just to kind of answer the board with Elestral, such as Sorlet and Mustachian. And honestly, Demeter I just feel is the better option. You enchant it with 2 Taratless, expend 1, giving it 3 attack and 3 defense. With this deck, just hits so much better breakpoints than just the 2 attack from Scythe. And I think that's mostly because I have so many 2 attack stuff. Foamee, Aphros, P-Gust, Peliquarius. Hitting 4, it's a good number, but hitting 5 is just so much better because there's a lot with 4 defense that you need to hit over, and there's quite a few with 4 attack as well. So I just feel like Demeter is the better option to be able to do that. And on top of that, we have so many other responses to stuff that sometimes it's fine to not necessarily have the ability to attack over it, as Earthquake here is one way to answer it, and we have so many counter runes as well that sometimes it's honestly just fine to enchant a Demeter, throw up a Peliquarius defense, throw up a Foamee, and just rely on like the counter runes and such to do the work. So that's why I don't think Scythe is necessary anymore. It's too high risk. And whenever I was playing it, I was just like, I could play Scythe, but this plays better. So as such, I just cut it to be able to run more cards. Earthquake's still here at 2 as just a phenomenal answer if I fall behind. I feel 2 is only necessary because my goal is to try to keep the Celestial Vantage on board and be able to answer my opponent's stuff. Thus, 3 Earthquake, to me, felt like too much, and 2 feels like that sweet spot. For my counter runes, I still run 3 Shield Achilles, but now I run 3 Poison Tip Arrow. I like this 3 counter runes a bit more, as it's great to be able to respond to the board more, and again, I made room with Scythe, so I could run more of these. Shield is just probably the best counter rune. Sending your opponent back their normal enchant is phenomenal, And it plays into the strategy of the deck of wanting to be ahead on number of Elestrals on board. Poison Tip Arrow here, I really like this card as it is 2 spirits to deal with the opponent's Elestral, and I don't really... this deck doesn't matter as much if they can still do stuff with those Elestrals compared to, say, using Gorgon's Gaze, because we still have response to, like, Foamee floating into something, and this deck doesn't need to get control of the board right away either, so I like having a cheaper counter rune option to, say, Gorgon's Gaze, and the biggest reason why is Gorgon's Gaze, while it completely stops the opponent's Celestial from doing anything that turn, it means I need to have an answer to it next turn, meaning I use 2 spirits to stall and I need to use more spirits to answer it. Meanwhile, Poison Tip Arrow, at worst, is 1 spirit to disrupt their plays, and I just use the spirits next turn to answer it, or I can just expend the extra spirit right then and there, so for 2 spirits, I dealt with it. And again, even though they can answer my board, in this deck, doesn't really matter too much. Rounding out the deck, I run Nectar of the Gods back at 3 copies and 3 Ambrosia. I was running at 2, but draw power-wise, I really feel like I need it, and I was really thinking about this card again. And again, you don't always have to run it, or you don't always have to use it. It does stink because it is technically a dead card in hand, but I feel like this deck really wants to see that draw power, to see its outs, to see its pieces. It's just nice to have when I need to dig deeper. I started realizing that spirit count isn't everything. It's how effectively you're using the cards, and being able to see more cards means that you have more options to use more effectively. So I like Nectar of the Gods at 3. It also means that I'm more likely to see it in my opening hand, meaning I get to see more options on my first turn. Ambrosia here at 3, of course, as always, since I'm running 3 elements here, Ambrosia is great just to be able to get back specific elements if I have specific cards I need to play. Thus, I can run less copies of certain spirits. On top of that, it just helps with survivability, and as this still is a pretty expensive deck, as Foamee, Globby, Capricorn, Tadpuff, Mustachian, Sorlet, a couple 2-cost stuff. I have a lot of stuff that use multiple spirits. Therefore, Ambrosia will help with longevity for me to really capitalize off of these effects without burning out too quickly. Moving on to the spirit count, I run 11 Leviathan, 4 Toratlas, 5 Lycris. 5 Lycris because my thought process is that I have 1 spirit for each Picas, Pelacraeus, and Sorlet, as well as 2 spare spirits for an extra enchant or a Sorlet or 2 Sorlet uses. And then from there, especially from my playtesting, I felt like this was accurate. If I needed more Wind Spirits, I had Ambrosia to get it back, or I just didn't need more Wind Spirits. There was a few times where I'm like, if only I had another Wind Spirit, I could use Sorlet, but I had another out anyway, and a lot of times, even misenchanting Sorlet the 5 attack is enough. I run 4 Toratlas now because with only running Demeter and Earthquake, that just means that I can set 2 spirits on 1 Demeter and use an Earthquake, and then just get the rest back with Ambrosia. I won't always need the Demeter. I won't always need the Earthquake. Sometimes I need 2 Demeter. Sometimes I need 2 Earthquake. I just felt like that these cards, since they're so situational, I really just need to make sure I have 1 use of each, and most of the time I'll see Ambrosia if I need a second use of it. 11 Leviathan because I have such a heavy water package, and I really just want the Leviathan there to have and not rely on Ambrosia as much, as they're more... don't necessarily want to say the proactive plays, but they're more... I'm going to want them to use them more frequently. There's more scenarios where they will come up than, say, like Earthquake or Demeter. So therefore, I just like having these, and also really just having 1 spirit that I can easily use for Nectar of the Gods, or if I need to expend spirits. Just kind of a surplus that I can just say, okay, I can just have to throw them away and hold on to those stuff. Spirit management in this deck is huge, though, as I am trying to balance 3 elements, so you really need to kind of feel out which ones you need to keep, which ones you should throw away. And that just comes with practicing the deck and learning the matchups. I guess the only kind of tip I have is that sometimes it's really nice to do like 1 Leviathan, 1 Lycris on like an early Nectar of the Gods, unless like you know you're going to need those wind. Just because you could get them back with Ambrosia, and that just means that you're not expending your Leviathans too quickly. I can go over like a ton of scenarios I've encountered that go over this, but really I think it's just something that you need to learn from experience and try to get a feel for yourself. Moving to the side deck here, I run 3 Resting on Your Laurels, as if I'm up against a deck that definitely keeps throwing out threats and I feel like I need more removal, Resting on Your Laurels is a fantastic way to get caught up. It's not as generic as Earthquake, but just having some extra removal cards to just really answer threats can be really nice, as there's some decks that can keep throwing out threat after threat after threat. Specifically what I'm thinking of and why I include this card was I saw some decks that take advantage of full carries and its power up effect with like Hammer, Forge. There's also a similar combo in Earth with Tectoros, Folio Forest. It just becomes it can increase their attack so much that I really can't reliably deal with Sorlet, Mustachian, even with I mean, Demeter a lot of times can deal with it, but that can be dangerous in the Tectorus matchup as Demeter only fuels it. Therefore, I want to just see more hard removal so I don't have to rely on attacking over it as much, as in those situations it's not as reliable of a strategy. For the same reason, I also run the third Earthquake just in case I need it. I also run 3 Tornado in the sideboard, as against decks that wants to set up some Divine Runes, maybe the Stadiums, or Artifact Runes, Tornado is a fantastic way to punish them. And that's really the best use case for it. Counter Runes, I mean, sure, if you're running it, sometimes you can bounce back a Counter Rune to really get ahead on board. That's definitely a use case, but I really only want to see really side into these if I know my opponent plays a heavy rune count that can be easily punished by Tornado, and that's when those runes are enchanted. So the 3 are Stadium, Artifact, Divine. And again, it just kind of helps me if my opponent can buff up their attack so high that I can't really attack over them. Tornado is a cheap way to be able to help my Elestrals be able to attack over them. I also run 3 Tsunami for when I'm against non-Water Spirit decks, as this is just a phenomenal counter rune to slow them down, especially against aggressive decks. This is just an easy tech in addition to what I already have. Maybe my top end with Capricorn Globby is a bit too slow. I can make some room there. It just gives me more ways to slow down my opponent and give me more time to answer their board and put them in a place where they can't come back. And a lot of times just changing them to defense position, especially against the Celestial deck, the aggressive decks, their defense are so low that I really don't need to see certain buffs, or I don't need to necessarily deal with them, as my Celestials can just attack over them anyway. It's also nice if if your opponent's running a non-water spirit deck, I can just replace the poison tip arrows with the tsunamis, unless I feel like I need that poison tip arrow's destruction effect. But it's just a cheaper way than poison tip arrow that is more disruptive than poison tip arrow. Just not as flexible, but that's again comes from reading the matchup, as there's certainly matchups where just a cheaper option is better. Finally, I run 2 Poseidon as sort of a flex spot. This was probably the least tested one in my side deck, but I included it here as an easy way to next off of Aphros, so this can be a great inclusion in slower matchups where I can afford to use the spirits on Poseidon to get a Poseidon Aphros combo. But also I could see this giving me the edge in a slower matchup by being able to accelerate spirits onto my board through its Nexus effect to try to whittle my opponent's resources down faster than they are. So again, this is probably the least tested of the bunch, but that's the theory behind it. And of course, it just combos really well with Aphros anyway. And honestly, looking through, having such a limited card pool, looking through everything else, there wasn't really much else I want to include, because sure, I could include our third Aphros, but I have Pelacorius to search it out. Foamee can float into it. I could include a third Tadpuff, but I just don't think that's necessary for the reasons. Like, I'm running 3 Tadpuff, and frankly, I've never encountered a scenario, and nor can I think of a scenario right now where I want a third Tadpuff. And kind of same thing with Pelacorius. I could run a third Pelacorius, but 2's been feeling just fine. It's more situational card, so I kind of wanted to include something that would give my deck a different angle to it, to kind of be more well-rounded to answer various decks. I don't run any spirits to switch out in my side deck because I figured if like I'm including another Earthquake, I can probably cut out Demeter, because usually if I need more removal, it's because Demeter isn't enough. So therefore, that's an easy way to conserve on Earth spirits. For wind spirits, usually it's just because with the wind spirits, I'm trying to just capitalize their usage as soon as possible with the tornadoes. As if I'm playing against a deck that kind of sets up, I don't foresee me needing too many wind spirits for the long game. I really just need to bounce their stuff back, force them to expend spirits, and I don't need that longevity. A lot of times they'll just kind of put my opponent so far behind, I just win anyway. And I've got plenty of water spirits for Tsunami with Poseidon and such. And again, as I talked, Tsunami can easily switch out Poison Tip Arrow, which is generic anyway, and most of the time I'd be using water for it. And also Tsunami might come and be replacing some of the top end if it's just too slow, therefore that frees up some water. Actually, that frees up a lot of water spirits. And of course, Resting on Your Laurels is generic anyway, so don't really need to fix the spirit lineup anyway. So I've alluded to it. I don't think I've explicitly said what the strategy of this deck is. The strategy is to control the opponent's board in the early game with cards like P-Gust to control runes, or counter runes especially, because those are some of the easiest ways to counter my top, or to really punish me going into my top end. And then control the Elestrals on board with stuff like Sorlet, Mustachian, Earthquake, Demeter to increase attack, my counter runes to like shield to set the opponent back, their normal enchant, Poison Tip Arrow to either disrupt their plays or just straight up destroy their Elestrals. And really the idea is that I want to set it up so that I have the trade advantage on board. So like when my opponent plays an Elestral, I can trade into it. And even more ideally, to actually have more Elestrals than my opponent on board, as that allows me to start attacking their spirit deck while also still attacking over whatever Elestral they play. And that's where like Foamee and Capricorn come into play, as they're great at helping build wide on the board, and then Globby here and Afro's here to help move spirits around on board to better start chipping away your opponent's spirit deck. So the end game, once you have control of the board, is to then shift into beatdown with the intent to run your opponent out of their spirit deck as fast as possible, or I should say as fast as possible, but to more quickly run your opponent out of their spirit deck so they have less spirits to work with to try to answer your board, which is very pressing since it's really hard to deal with multiple Elestrals on board right now. I've had a lot of success with this strategy, a lot of fun with this deck. I do think it's a more skill intensive deck to be able to pilot, and it won't be the easiest to learn. But if you really like a challenge to learn a deck, I think this deck will be really rewarding and you'll find some good success with it. In terms of how it ranks in the meta, honestly, I don't know. I haven't played any tournaments. We keep getting new cards introduced anyway, so I don't know. We won't have a good idea how good this deck is until the whole first set is released and we know all the final effects as well. But with that being said, though, I think it's a phenomenal deck to learn, to try out while we're still in this kind of nebulous format, ever changing. And I'm really excited to see how this deck will continue to evolve and perform as we get closer to Kickstarter and the official release of Elestrals. With all that being said, though, I'd like to hear if you're running a similar deck to mine. How does it differ? What do you think of my deck? Are you excited to try it out? Or do you have questions for me about this deck? I am always trying to check those comments and answer any questions and respond to stuff. So please, I love the interaction here. And of course, on the Elestrals Discord, if you see me under my name there, which is not my YouTube name, it's just Jacob V, please also feel free to ask me questions, ask for some games, or ask for some pointers, or uh, tell me about your version of the deck. Really, I just want to keep interacting with this amazing community, sharing ideas, having some fun playing this game. Because at the end of the day, I'm here to have fun and learn as much as I can about this game.